Hello, comrades. Welcome to this two-part lecture on World War II. This first part will cover the causes and the early portion of the war, and part two will cover the end of the war plus the Holocaust. So let's get going. All right, you can't talk about World War II without Nazi aggression. That is pretty much the cause of the European theater of World War II. So Hitler has now gained power by 1933. So remember, 1933, I would say, is a date you should remember. That is when Hitler becomes dictator of Germany. He becomes Führer technically in 1934, but he was really dictator by 33. And he ran on a platform of promising to ignore pretty much the entirety of the Treaty of Versailles, and he's going to start doing it. So as soon as he becomes dictator, he starts dramatically increasing the size of the German military, well beyond the 100,000 that the treaty required. He's actually going to create a Luftwaffe, which is a German Air Force, that was strictly banned by the Treaty of Versailles, and he's just going to start making all of this. So the German army in World War I was like 2 million soldiers. The German army in World War II at its height, which will include volunteers and conscripts, is like 13 million. Like, yes, that's how much he's going to rearm Germany by the end of World War II. All right, so next thing he'll do, that'll violate the Treaty of Versailles, is he flat out sends the German military into the Rhineland. Remember, the Rhineland is on the western portion of Germany, on the coast of the Rhine River, and effectively takes it over and calls it German Germany. Because historically, because of the Treaty of Versailles, it was supposed to be demilitarized. Yes, it was still German, but it was demilitarized. But this, again, flat-out violation of the Treaty of Versailles. So what should the British and the French do? What should the League of Nations do? Well, in theory, they should call a meeting and say, Hitler, don't do this. But Hitler's going to realize the League of Nations has no teeth, to use that analogy. All right, continuing along. Next major violation of the Treaty of Versailles is he flat out annexes Austria. So it's called Anschluss. And flat out says Austria is now mine. So to the credit of the Prime Minister of Austria, he actually tried really hard to prevent the annexation of Austria to Germany. But Hitler has, at 1938, a massive war machine. Like, you cannot stand up against the Nazi war machine in 1938. So Austria has now been added to the German Empire, and of course they're going to be calling it the Third Reich. And now Hitler sets his sights to Czechoslovakia. Remember, Czechoslovakia has a bunch of different ethnic groups, Czechs, Slovaks, but also has a decent number of ethnic Germans in it. And specifically in a section of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. So Sudetenland's kind of like on the northwest portion of Czechoslovakia. A large number of ethnic Germans are there. It's also a strong area of industrialization in Czechoslovakia. So Hitler has many interests in this area, and basically when he sets his sights on the Sudetenland, that's when the League of Nations, largely the British and the French, are going to call for a meeting with Hitler and themselves. And that's going to lead to the Munich Conference of 1938, which will be on the next slide. All right, the one to know out of all of these, besides, I would say, actually, the Czechoslovakia one, is going to be Hitler's invasion of Poland, because that's going to quite literally start World War II. So 1939, he signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Basically, he wants to kind of keep the Soviets out of the war for as long as humanly possible, because he's going to be engaging all these invasions of Europe. He basically wants to make sure the Soviet Union does not declare war on him out of a sense of insecurity. So he signs that non-aggression pact. He obviously is going to violate that 2 years later, bringing the Soviet Union into the war later on. So there'll be more slides on Poland and all this, but this is really the major cause of World War II, is Hitler taking over a bunch of land in Central and Eastern Europe. Eventually, when he invades Poland, that is the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's when the British and French declare war. All right, give that a read if you'd like. Hitler giving a speech in Vienna. That's Austria, by the way. Okay, so put a star on this slide as well. Knowing the term appeasement is going to be super important. It even comes up on the Regents exam all the time. Circle and star the term appeasement. So the verbatim definition of appeasement is you give in to the demands of an aggressor, and here's the key part: to basically make the aggressor happy and prevent something worse from happening. So you give in to the aggressor in hopes that it will satisfy them and then they won't do anything else. So I'm going to bring it back to me in 4th grade. 4th grade, E.R. Hughes. I had a bully. His name was Billy. And Billy made me give him $1 for lunch every single day. He wanted to buy pizza. And he's a big guy. I was tiny. I was always the smallest person in my grade. I don't want to I'm not going to test this. And Billy said, if you don't give me that $1, things are not going to happen the way you want. So I kept giving him that $1. I would literally give him my lunch money, quite literally every single day for a month straight. And what am I doing? I'm appeasing the bully. I'm appeasing the aggressor because I don't want something worse to happen. And how does that bully view me? It makes me view me as a wuss. And he knows he can take advantage of me. He's going to keep doing it until he realizes that I actually am someone to be reckoned with. AKA I go tell my teacher that I'm being bullied and extorted. I didn't use that word in 4th grade, probably. Maybe I did, I don't know. And then eventually he gets yelled at and stops doing it. So the problem with appeasement is that the bully thinks you're a wuss, and they're going to keep doing what they're doing. So here's what happens in 1938. So we have the Munich Conference. The British and French call a meeting with themselves, Hitler plus Mussolini. So here we go. We got Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister, WWII, French presidents, Hitler, and then Benito Mussolini. And I don't even know who Benito Mussolini is kind of staring at right now, but weird. So essentially, Chamberlain and WWII ask Hitler, what do you want? Hitler, what do you want? And Hitler's going to say, I want the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. Just the Sudetenland. Not all of Czechoslovakia, just the Sudetenland. And Chamberlain is going to use this policy of appeasement. Like, all right, if you have the Sudetenland, will you stop? Hitler said, absolutely, I promise. And Chamberlain's like, done. They give Hitler the Sudetenland. Oh, by the way, guess who really wasn't present? Czechoslovakia. Whoops. So Hitler now takes over Sudetenland, and he realizes he just got what he wanted. How does he view the policy of appeasement? How does he view the British and the French? He views them as wusses. He can take advantage of them. They have no teeth. And what does he do? The German military takes over all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland. So the policy of appeasement is going to ultimately lead to Chamberlain's demise. He was a member of he was leader of the Conservative Party in Britain, and they're basically going to push him out because of the failure of appeasement. He literally got off the plane in London saying, "There's peace in our time." Ouch, that didn't end too well or age very well. So the policy of appeasement basically allows Hitler to take over more land, and now he has a good portion of Central Europe under his control. So, folks, please remember appeasement. Please remember my bully. By the way, we actually became really good friends, don't worry, by high school. You're fantastic. All right, I digress. Sort of. All right, next. So, the actual start of the war. So, the agreement between the Soviets and Nazi Germany to divide Poland in half. So the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, literally, they divided Poland in half. Soviet Union got the eastern half, Germany got the western half. And Soviet Union's going to invade the eastern half, and that doesn't cause World War II. But as soon as Nazi Germany invades the western half of Poland, Britain and France immediately declare war on Germany. So September 1st, 1939, important date to know, World War II begins. So Nazi Germany is going to employ a very different tactic compared to at least World War I, where it is meant to knock your enemy out of the war immediately. It's called Blitzkrieg. And yes, this term preceded American football. So the term means lightning warfare. Blitz, lightning, Krieg, war in German. And basically it means you send everything you got in your arsenal at the enemy, knock them out. So what's unique about World War II is all that technology from World War I that was kind of invented around that time period is perfected now. So the airplane, the tank, these things are fast now. The airplanes go at least 300-400 miles per hour. Tanks go up to 40-50 miles per hour. And they're combining the tanks with soldiers. And the German army can just basically pierce any foreign military, no problem. So parachute raids. So essentially you could put soldiers in a plane, jump out of the plane, they parachute behind enemy lines and take over key like bridges, things like that. And basically you hit the enemy, they don't know what's going on, and they're out of the war. So Poland is knocked out of the war in basically a month. Then he's going to turn his sights to something else. Western Europe. So, yes, the British and French declared war in early September 1939, but they actually didn't fight Nazi Germany really until the spring of 1940. So they call this period between September 1939 and the spring of 1940 the quote-unquote phony war, because really Britain and France didn't like actually have their militaries ready to like fight Germany. So they really actually weren't fighting until the spring of 1940. So this spring offensive by Nazi Germany is really where the European theater truly kicks off. So he just starts knocking out these Western European countries. Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway. Folks, Norway was in the war for 6 months. Sorry, not 6 months. 6 hours. Norway was at war with Germany for 6 hours before they capitulated. That's how fast this is happening. So what will happen next is Hitler's main goal for at least continental Europe, France. That's going to be the next domino to fall. So, in between World War I and World War II, France didn't want to get invaded by Germany again. So, they spent a ton of money creating this heavily fortified, like, defensive line in Alsace-Lorraine. Remember, France got Alsace-Lorraine from the Treaty of Versailles, and they called it the Maginot Line. And, like, it is just, like, bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery, mortars, mines. It's like the whole shebang. Like, you can't go through this thing. And it's right in the middle of Alsace-Lorraine, right on the border between them and Germany. And they built it basically for a good portion of Alsace-Lorraine. Like it's long. And so when Hitler is going to invade France in the summer of 1940, he's just not going to even touch the Maginot Line. He's just going to go around it. So Nazi Germany invaded through the Ardennes forest, which is basically they go through Belgium again, Belgium and Luxembourg specifically, and they knock France out of the war in less than 2 months. In less than 2 months! There are German soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées. So France is going to surrender, and for the surrender, Hitler ordered his soldiers to scour France to find that one rail car that the Germans surrendered in at the end of World War I. Yeah, that same exact one. They found it rusting. Vines were growing over it. Hitler brought it back into like the main part of France. They signed the capitulation right there. Oh, yeah, talk about how petty that one is. So now France is out of the war. Who's left to stand up against Nazi Germany? It's basically just the British. Remember, the Soviet Union is not actually in the war yet. They have the eastern half of Poland, but they haven't declared war against Germany because Germany hasn't invaded them yet. So it is just the British, not even the Americans yet. Americans get in the war until December 8th, 1941. That's the day after Pearl Harbor, by the way. So here is a map of the Maginot Line. So this basically this red, like the dark red line you see here, it's right in the middle of Alsace-Lorraine, and it is the Maginot Line. It's very strong fortified. But what is Hitler going to do? He's simply going to invade through the Ardennes forest, plus a little bit of Luxembourg, and he'll knock out France in less than 2 months. Yeah, that was that simple. Blitzkrieg worked. Same idea, just a little bit more detailed. And Hitler had a personal photographer. His name was Heinrich Hoffmann. He actually was a really good photographer. Just, of course, he was a Nazi, and that's not good. So anyway, an incredible photograph he took of Hitler touring the Eiffel Tower. Okay, so what happens to France after they surrendered? So basically, it was basically kind of split in half, more or less. So there's two sections. You have the occupied zone and Vichy France, quote unquote, free. And I use the word free very, 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 very loosely. So the occupied zone is like direct German control. So like German soldiers in the streets, they were the police Like they controlled it, period, direct control. But then you had Vichy France, which was a fascist puppet state that had complete allegiance to Nazi Germany, and they call it Vichy because its capital city was in the city of Vichy. So essentially they divided the country in half. But again, for the sake of simplicity, just say Germany controlled all of France until June of 1944. So the person who's going to really lead the French resistance against this occupation is a guy you definitely got to know, especially post-World War II, Charles de Gaulle. So French general, and he was able to escape to London. A lot of the major leadership of the French military was able to escape to London before the full surrender. And he was basically kind of coordinating the resistance movements against Nazi Germany. So from 1940 to 1944, French civilians were consistently attacking Nazi Germany from behind the lines, blowing up railways. The French partisan resistance was truly impressive, and that largely was led by a lot of women, too. All right, so going now to Britain. So now that the French have fallen and the rest of Western Europe has fallen, Britain is the last country standing in the way of Nazi Germany. Hitler wanted to take over Great Britain. He would have invaded Great Britain if he could have. So he starts by basically, he wants to soften the British military. So they call this the Blitz. At least the British call it the Blitz. But the true name is called the Battle of Britain. So in 1940, essentially, Nazi Germany is just going to start bombing Britain into the Stone Age. And consistent every single day, the Luftwaffe is going to hit major British cities. They're specifically going to target civilian populations. They definitely were targeting like British military, but overwhelmingly, they were really aiming for the British civilians. Hitler wanted to destroy the morale of British civilians, which maybe would have provoked the British military into surrendering, but actually that was a miscalculation. Hitler really should have focused on taking out the British armed forces in these bombings, more than just simply bombing like civilian portions of London, what have you. So that was actually a tactical error of Hitler. So essentially, they're going to kill tens of thousands of British civilians, actually up to about 100,000 I've seen. And the new prime minister, conservative, named Winston Churchill, as you can see right here, he's going to really effectively kind of like consolidate British morale and start resisting the German bombings of Great Britain. So the true change, kind of like turning point, that helped the British stave off the full invasion of Great Britain is the invention of the radar. Give it a star. It actually came up on the Global Regents a couple of years ago as I'm recording this in 2023. And here's what the radar does. As soon as like a German bomber lifts off of, say, I don't know, a French airport or a German airport, goes over the English Channel, the British can detect that with this radar, and they can scramble their fighters to engage the German bombers, hopefully over the English Channel or at least the southern part of England, and shoot them down before they're able to actually bomb whatever they're supposed to bomb. And that invention effectively saved the British Isles. If they didn't get radar, Germany would consistently just kept bombing, and eventually probably would have just flat out invaded Britain. So the radar was a hugely important invention for the British that helped save them from an invasion. So a little bit of a fun fact here. As you can see, Winston Churchill holding his V for victory sign. No, it's not a peace sign. It's a V for victory sign. And initially, he was positioning his hand backwards. And in British English, if you flip the V here, it actually doesn't mean V for victory. It is the equivalent of the middle finger for the British. And one of his staff actually had to tell him what that really meant. Because Winston Churchill's like upper middle class. He doesn't understand working class slang. And one of his staffers actually had to tell him, hey, you shouldn't do that because it doesn't mean what you think it means. Whoops. Okay, now for the beginning of the Pacific Theater. So as I mentioned either in class or another ed puzzle, don't forget about Japan starting in the early 1900s. Remember, 1905, they defeated the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. And by the early 1930s, they're going to invade Manchuria and China. Remember, Manchuria was a naturally resource-rich area of China. And why does Japan invade places? Because they want natural resources, because their country doesn't have a lot of them naturally. So, then, by the late 1930s, they have taken over pretty much all of the eastern portion of China. They've colonized it. And it is going to get extremely ugly. So give a circle to the rape of Nanking. It is one of the most egregious human rights abuses of World War II, especially on the Pacific Theater is concerned. And essentially, when the Japanese military took over the city of Nanking, or Nanjing, it's the same thing, the generals that took it over told their soldiers, you have essentially 1 month to do whatever you want to the city and the people of Nanking. And if you read some of the primary sources, the people who experience it, it's just, it makes you sick to your stomach. They had competitions on how many pregnant women they could stab through the womb. There was actually a competition between 2 Japanese generals on how many Chinese civilians they could behead in one day with their samurai swords. Just absolutely horrific impact on the civilian population of China. The numbers are very scattered on how many civilians were killed, because it largely depends on if you're talking about Chinese sources, Japanese sources, but at least 100,000 civilians, at least, are killed in this rape in Nanking in 1 month. So now that they've taken over pretty much the major part of China, which is the east coast of it, they're going to set their sights towards the Pacific Islands. So they're just going to dramatically increase the size of their colonial empire by early 1940. So what is the United States doing? So remember, the United States has quite a few different colonies in the Pacific, most famously being the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, and also note that Hawaii, even though it's not a state yet, is a legit territory of the United States. So the United States had the central location of their Pacific Fleet was in Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. And Japan essentially knew that it was kind of only a matter of time until the United States would probably declare war on them because of their expansionary policies. So here's actually what provoked the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the United States, which at this point it's led by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, they actually cut off all of the oil supplies to Japan. So at this point, the United States is the world's largest oil producer. And actually, fun fact, in 2023, America still is the world's largest oil producer. And Japan, that was like their main trading partner for oil, was the United States. They're like, oh crap, we now know that America's probably gonna get into the war. And they wanted one effort to basically knock out the American Pacific Fleet to kind of prevent them from attacking their colonial possessions. So they plan a secret attack on that Pacific Fleet that was located in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And they knock out a bunch of American battleships, destroyers. Approximately 4,000 American sailors are killed. And this, America's going to declare war the very next day on December 8th, 1941. And only one congressperson actually voted no. Her name was Jeanette Rankin. She actually voted no on declarations of war for both World War I and World War II, fun fact. So the key part of the attack on Pearl Harbor is the United States had none of its aircraft carriers actually docked in Pearl Harbor. And the aircraft carrier is dramatically more important than a battleship ever will be. The aircraft carrier is you can put a couple hundred planes on it and you put them in the sea, you can get really close to the enemy's home islands, and then you can bomb them using those planes. They are much more effective than battleships are. Aircraft carriers are the top of the line. This is the new technology of war. And that truly is what's allowed the United States to actually recover a little bit faster than the Japanese expected, is because the American aircraft carriers were untouched because they were not docked actually in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They got really lucky. So then from there, Japan is starting knocking out the other American bases that are in select islands in the Pacific Ocean. And they eventually get the United States to surrender in the Philippines by May of 1942, and it's looking really bad. By 1942, the war is looking very one-sided. It's very pro-Axis powers. Germany is crushing it, Japan is crushing it. It's really looking ugly and scary by 1942. So the key turning point in the Pacific theater it's called the Battle of Midway. So the Battle of Midway essentially it's largely aircraft carriers. Here's a fun fact: the aircraft carriers never actually saw each other. The Japanese and the American carriers never saw each other. That's how far apart they were. It was just their airplanes bombing each other. And the United States makes a major blow to the Japanese aircraft carriers, wins the battle, and essentially what this allows the United States to do is now attacking, going on the offensive in the Pacific theater as opposed to the defensive. So from there, the United States is going to like selectively attack Japanese-controlled islands in the Pacific, and that's going to lead to the American policy called island hopping, which I'll get to in probably another slide in a bit. All right, so this is just a list of all these other areas that Japan took over. I just want to point out a few of these that will probably have more importance later on post-World War II. So one, Japan takes over French Indochina. So French Indochina is like modern-day Vietnam, and the person who's going to lead the resistance against Japanese control of French Indochina was Ho Chi Minh. And guess who's going to lead the resistance against French colonialism after that? Ho Chi Minh. You're going to be a key Vietnamese nationalist to know, especially for the global regents exam. What else do I want to cover here? Make a note of British Burma. So remember, Burma was the British name for today's Myanmar. They get right to the border of British India. So again, Japan is taking over a bunch of European colonies, largely British colonies, during their expansion in the early 1940s. All right, before I leave this slide here, one person to be aware of is this guy here. His name's Hideki Tojo. And Hideki Tojo was the Japanese war minister, and really he pretty much ran Japan. Obviously the emperor does, but it's truly this guy. And he committed countless war crimes. And eventually, at the end of the war, soldiers actually surround his palace that he was in, and he tried to commit suicide by shooting himself in the heart, but he missed. And the soldiers captured him and gave him, like, supplies and saved his life. And he's eventually put on trial for war crimes, very convicted, very much so, and then hanged later on. So if you do see Hideki Tojo, he's one of the more awful leaders of the Japanese government. All right, so this map is a good one. It shows you just the extent of the Japanese empire up to 1942, 1942 being the height of the empire. So as you can see, when 1931, they invade Manchuria, and then they kind of continually go south, taking over the major huge cities of China, and then going into French Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam, getting into Cambodia, Burma, you get it, taking over the U.S.-controlled Philippines, Indonesia, which was controlled by the Dutch at that point. So, there you go. Here's another good map, kind of showing you truly how much of a World War II is in fact was. And here we have I just mentioned the Pacific Theater, so it's really showing the United States in their island hopping campaign, where the U.S. is going to selectively choose which islands to take over, knock the Japanese military out, and basically get closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. Then in the European theater, which is split into really the Eastern Front, Soviet Union invading or attacking Germany from the east, and the Western Front, which is like the British, Americans, French, Canadians, attacking from the west. But also don't forget about the Italian Front. The U.S. and Britain are going to invade Sicily in 1942, and then kind of like track right up the boot like that north. And there's also the African Front, but largely North Africa. So there's many different continents, as you can know. Also, a little fun fact, Japan actually invaded America during World War II. Yes, it did. So Japan's going to invade the Aleutian Islands. And the Aleutian Islands, part of Alaska, although Alaska is not a state yet, but it is an American territory. So there's actually some pretty brutal fighting between the U.S. and Japan up in the Aleutian Islands. All right. Oh, come on. There we go. All right. So now let's go back to the European theater. So this is what's going to bring the Soviet Union into the war. So Germany is going to stab the Soviet Union in the back. So they signed their Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, also known as the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact. They divided Poland in half, and that basically kept the Soviet Union out of the war for 2 years. Year and a half, I suppose. So Hitler, part of his grand idea of Lebensraum, which is German living space, he wants Eastern Europe for German expansion. So Germans have more areas to live. He also viewed Slavs as inferior ethnic groups. And he's going to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And that was his single greatest mistake of World War II. Yes. Invading the Soviet Union was Hitler's greatest mistake. Why? Because, well, one, he now has a two-front war. Two, he has now just engaged in battle, the largest military on Earth. Oops. Yeah. So the Soviet Union is going to take some initial hits. Like, it's going to look really ugly for basically a year and a half, 2 years into the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. But eventually, they'll be able to stop the German advance and then counterattack and push all the way to Berlin. All right, so once again, Hitler's going to invade in June of 1941, and he pushes right to the border of 3 major cities in the Soviet Union, right to the border of Leningrad, which is old school St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Stalingrad. 3 of the major cities of the Soviet Union. He is right there. He besieges Leningrad for 900 days, almost takes over Moscow, almost takes over Stalingrad. So what the Russians are going to do is their classic tactic that we've already covered when France invaded Russia in 1812. So they're going to use their scorched earth technique. They will retreat, they will destroy anything they can't take with them, and basically leave the Nazi army with no supplies. Stretch out the supply trains, and they're going to starve out the Germans. They're going to wait for them to freeze to death, quite literally. So now we get into the winter of 1941-42, and by February of 1942 is the beginning of the largest battle of World War II, which is the Battle of Stalingrad. Give it a few stars. Out of really any battle to know in World War II, it's probably going to be Stalingrad, maybe D-Day, but probably Stalingrad. And this is, like, both Germany and the Soviet Union are going to pour every ounce of their army into this battle. Why does Germany want it? 2 reasons. One, it has a symbolism. It has Stalin's name in it. Grad, by the way, means city of, so literally the city of Stalin. And also, Stalingrad is the last major defense of the oil-rich area of the Soviet Union called the Caucasus. And if he takes this over, he now has effectively unlimited oil supplies. And you need oil to fuel, literally, your tanks and your airplanes. So this has immense amount of importance for the Nazis, and the Soviet Union is going to make sure they don't take it. The fighting is absolutely brutal. Obviously, it's in the winter into the summer of 1943. We are talking about millions and millions and millions of casualties, deaths and wounded. It's awful. But the Soviet Union, despite losing more soldiers, they win. Because if there's one advantage they have, it's A, the home field advantage, and B, they do have more manpower. So what Stalingrad symbolizes is this is truly the turning point of World War II. Because no longer is the Soviet Union on the defensive, they are now going to be on the offensive. The Nazis will start retreating. This is their first, truly their major loss of the war, and now they're going to be retreating from Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union is going to be pushing in from the east. And eventually, once we get to the D-Day invasion in June 1944, the British, French, and Americans are going to be pushing in from the west and kind of strangling Nazi Germany. So, look at the extent of the German Third Reich by 1942. So essentially, dark red is like direct German control, German Empire, and then the lighter red is like German allies. They didn't necessarily have to invade to take it over, but there were like German troop presence. There's actually a really heavy resistance led by Joseph Tito in the Balkans against German control. So like that's a lot of land. I mean, again, look at how close Germany got to take over Leningrad, Moscow. Stalingrad would be like right around here. All right, another reading. Give it a read. Okay. So that'll be a perfect place to stop. Part 2 of this will cover, obviously, the Holocaust here and into the end of World War II. So thanks for listening. I'll see you later.